Chapter 1. Pause before you act, the power of reflection. I still remember the day my brother Hanani came from Judah. I had been busy in the king's palace, doing what I had always done, serving the wine, standing close enough to hear the king's words but never to speak unless spoken to. Life in Persia was comfortable and predictable. I had learned to live with order and duty. My place in the royal court came with trust and responsibility, and though I served a foreign king, I carried my faith quietly in my heart. But when Hanani came, everything changed. I was glad to see him at first, hoping to hear good news about our people. Maybe that the city was coming back to life, that the temple sacrifices had begun again, or that the land was finding peace. Instead, his eyes told me what his mouth hadn't yet said. His voice trembled as he spoke. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Those words struck me harder than any blow. I froze where I stood. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The room around me faded, and my thoughts went far away to a city I had only known through stories, a city built on God's promise and once filled with His glory. I could almost see it in my mind, stones scattered like bones, the temple desecrated, the gates turned to ashes. The city that once carried God's name now lay open and exposed. Something broke inside me that day. My hands grew weak, and the tasks before me lost their meaning. I felt a deep ache, not just for the city, but for what it represented. Jerusalem was not just a place. It was a symbol of identity, faith, and purpose. It was the heart of our covenant with God. To hear that it was in ruins felt like hearing that hope itself had fallen. I sat down. I couldn't pretend to be strong. I didn't try to explain my feelings or hide them. I just sat, and I wept. The palace was still bright and orderly, but in my heart I was standing among ruins. My tears were not only for the stones that had fallen, but for the people who had forgotten who they were. Yet even in my sorrow, something stirred within me. The pain was real, but it was not hopeless. It felt like the beginning of something, not the end. I sensed that God was trying to get my attention. I didn't rush to speak or to plan. Instead, I turned my heart toward Him. I began to fast and pray, not to escape the pain, but to understand it. I needed to see what God was showing me. I asked Him why this had happened and what He wanted me to do about it. I didn't want comfort. I wanted clarity. That was the moment my journey began, not when I picked up. Pause before you act, the power of reflection. Tools or gathered people, but when I sat down and sought God. There are moments in life when the right thing to do is nothing, at least not yet. Nehemiah's response to the painful news about Jerusalem wasn't driven by panic or pride. He didn't rush into plans or speeches. He sat down and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had heard. That pause was not weakness, it was wisdom. When he heard that the walls of Jerusalem were broken and the gates burned, Nehemiah didn't immediately start drawing blueprints or writing letters. Instead, he sat down, wept, mourned, fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah 1:4. That moment of silence became the foundation for everything that followed. His first action was not to move men, but to move heaven. In our world today, we are often pressured to act fast. We measure strength by speed and leadership by visible motion. But Nehemiah teaches something countercultural: pause before you act. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us that to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. The pause does not mean inactivity, it means preparation. God often works in the unseen silence before He manifests His plans in public. Jesus Himself practiced this principle. When He heard that His friend Lazarus was sick, He did not rush to Bethany immediately. John 11:6 says, when He heard that Lazarus was sick, He stayed where he was 2 more days. To those around Him, that delay looked like neglect, but it was divine timing. In waiting, He positioned Himself for a greater glory, the resurrection. Moses also had to learn this lesson. After killing an Egyptian in anger, thinking he was delivering Israel, he spent 40 years in the desert before God called him back. Exodus 2:11-15, Acts 7:25-30. The pause was God's training ground. What Moses couldn't achieve by human strength in one day, he later accomplished by divine direction in God's time. In modern times, this truth still holds. Consider Howard Schultz, the man who transformed Starbucks into a global brand. Before his big return to lead the company in 2008, he took time away to observe, reflect, and listen. The company was expanding quickly but losing its soul. Schultz said in an interview, "Sometimes you have to slow down to go fast again." That season of stillness gave him the clarity to rebuild not just the business, but its purpose. Or think of Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison. The world called it punishment, but God used it as preparation. By the time he came out, he had learned patience, restraint, and vision, the kind of wisdom that only silence and reflection can teach. Nehemiah's story shows us that the first step towards solving a problem is not action, it is understanding. Before you move your hands, you must steady your heart. His pause created room for clarity, and his prayer created space for divine direction. Proverbs 19:2 warns, "It is not good to have zeal without knowledge, nor to be hasty and miss the way." When we take time to wait on God, we acknowledge that our wisdom is not enough. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength." Nehemiah's strength was renewed in waiting. When he finally rose to act, he wasn't just reacting to bad news. He was responding to divine instruction. Pause before you act, the power of reflection. Sometimes God's greatest work in us happens not while we are moving, but while we are still. In stillness, He refines our motives. In waiting, He renews our faith. In prayer, He reveals His plan. Like Nehemiah, we must learn that before we build walls, we must build patience, and before we lead people, we must first listen to God. In that quiet season of mourning, something powerful happened. God began to align Nehemiah's emotions with His purpose. What started as sadness became a sacred burden. Nehemiah's tears were not wasted. They were the first step toward a strategy that would change the destiny of a nation. When Nehemiah wept, he wasn't just expressing sorrow, he was receiving assignment. His heart began to beat in rhythm with God's heart. Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." In that brokenness, God drew near and began to shape Nehemiah's burden into a vision. It was no longer just about broken walls. It was about restoring dignity, faith, and order to God's people. The same principle applies to every kind of rebuilding, whether in a life, a relationship, a business, or a community. Acting too quickly often leads to shallow results. Many people rush to fix problems without first understanding them. But when we take time to pause, to pray, and to understand, our actions carry weight. Reflection transforms reaction into revelation. David experienced something similar after his failure with Bathsheba. When Nathan confronted him, David didn't try to defend himself or move on quickly. He paused, confessed, and sought God's mercy. That quiet moment of repentance gave birth to Psalm 51, one of the most powerful prayers of restoration ever written. From that broken place, God rebuilt David's heart and renewed his calling. We see the same truth in modern times. After a devastating fire destroyed much of her orphanage in 1942, Gladys Aylward, the British missionary to China, didn't rush to rebuild. She spent days in fasting and prayer, seeking God's direction. Out of that stillness came the courage and clarity to lead nearly 100 orphans over the mountains to safety, a journey that would later inspire millions. Sometimes God uses our tears as tools for transformation. The pain that breaks us can also be the place where His purpose is born. Romans 8:28 reminds us that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Nehemiah's story shows that waiting on God doesn't delay destiny, it prepares it. When you pause before acting, you give God the space to work in you before He works through you. That's when ordinary concern becomes divine calling. That's when emotion turns into mission. And that's when your burden becomes the blueprint for something far greater than you could imagine. The book of Proverbs says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." Proverbs 21:5. Wisdom doesn't rush, it reasons with God. Nehemiah took that time, and as a result, when he finally stood before the king, his words carried authority and foresight. He wasn't guessing what to do, he had already received a strategy in prayer. His request for the king's permission, the letters for safe passage, and the timber for rebuilding were not spontaneous ideas. They were the fruit of days spent in reflection and divine conversation. Pause before you act. The power of reflection. In our own lives, moments of stillness often hold the answers we are chasing. When you pause before you act, you give God space to reorder your thoughts, calm your fears, and reveal the real problem beneath the surface. Sometimes what looks like an obstacle is actually an instruction, but you can't see it until you stop moving long enough to listen. Psalm 46:10 reminds us, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness is not inactivity, it's intentional focus. It is the place where human effort gives way to divine insight. Consider the life of Corrie ten Boom. When her family was arrested for hiding Jews during World War II, she faced loss, grief, and fear. Yet, in the silence of her prison cell, she chose to pause and pray. Out of that stillness came strength. When she was later released, she became a voice of forgiveness and hope to a wounded world. Her time of waiting wasn't wasted. It was the womb of her purpose. Pausing doesn't delay destiny. It prepares you for it. The time Nehemiah spent in prayer equipped him to build not just walls but a movement. The same is true for you. What feels like waiting may actually be the season where God is building wisdom within you. Because before He changes your situation, He often changes your sight. The strategic power of stillness. In leadership, stillness functions much like the pause before a musician plays the next note. That brief silence creates rhythm and clarity. Without it, the song becomes noise. The same is true in decision making. When you pause before acting, you create rhythm in your leadership space to evaluate, breathe, and think. It's in that gap that understanding grows. Modern psychology calls this strategic reflection, the process of thinking deeply before acting decisively. Studies have shown that leaders who practice reflective thinking are more innovative, make better long-term decisions, and build stronger teams. Harvard Business Review once reported that managers who spend just 15 minutes each day reflecting on their work performed 23% better than those who didn't. Reflection multiplies results. In business, this can mean pausing before launching a new product, expanding into a new market, or hiring a new team. Many of the most successful entrepreneurs are not those who move the fastest, but those who think the deepest. Steve Jobs was known for taking long walks before major decisions. Bill Gates retreats twice a year for what he calls think weeks, where he isolates himself to read, reflect, and refine Microsoft's direction. These pauses are not indulgences, they are investments. In relationships, stillness allows emotional clarity. It helps you respond instead of react. When a misunderstanding occurs, most people rush to defend or correct themselves. But taking a moment to breathe and reflect often reveals the deeper issue. What Nehemiah did when he sat down and wept is the same principle that preserves peace in a marriage, stabilizes friendships, and guides wise leadership. He let the weight of the moment teach him before he tried to fix it. Spiritually, stillness opens the door to divine insight. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." The verse doesn't only speak of worship, it speaks of trust. To be still is to surrender the illusion of control and allow God or clarity for the non-religious reader to bring light to confusion. It's in stillness that strategy is born, because stillness invites perspective that noise cannot give. Pause before you act, the power of reflection. When Nehemiah finally rose to act, his decisions were marked by precision. He knew what to ask the king for, how to organize his people, and how to counter opposition. None of that wisdom appeared suddenly. It was shaped in silence. The strategic lesson is simple. If you want to build well, learn to pause well. The pause is where vision matures and direction sharpens. It is where you separate urgency from purpose. Every leader, every builder, and every dreamer must master the rhythm of reflection, knowing when to move and when to wait. The world often measures success by speed, but God and time measure it by accuracy. The pause before action is what ensures that your next step lands on solid ground. Stillness doesn't slow you down, it sets your pace for what's ahead, creating space between emotion and action. There's a crucial window between what happens to you and how you respond. That space, though it may last only a few seconds, determines the quality of your decisions, the direction of your life, and often the fate of your endeavors. Most people collapse that window. They rush from feeling to doing, from reaction to regret. But wise people, strategic thinkers, and successful leaders learn to expand that space. They pause. When Nehemiah heard that Jerusalem's walls were in ruins, he didn't react with outrage or instant plans. He sat down and wept, Nehemiah 1:4. That pause wasn't weakness, it was emotional intelligence. He created distance between his feelings and his next move. That space allowed him to process pain, seek perspective, and prepare for purpose. In business and leadership, the same principle applies. The first emotional impulse is rarely the best guide. A market crash, a client's complaint, a team's mistake. These moments test the discipline of the mind. A hasty reaction can destroy years of credibility or profit. A measured pause can save both. Why the pause matters. Neuroscientists explain that under stress, the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain, takes control, flooding the body with adrenaline and cortisol. This is useful in danger, but disastrous in decision-making. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic, strategy, and foresight, shuts down when emotion dominates. Pausing gives your brain time to rebalance. It restores access to your higher reasoning so you can act from clarity, not chaos. Strategic thinkers in every field understand this. In the military, officers are trained to assess before you advance. In business, successful CEOs like Satya Nadella of Microsoft practice empathetic leadership, listening before deciding. In negotiations, silence is a tool. In conflict, it's a shield. The pause gives you control over yourself, which is the foundation of controlling any situation. How to create space between emotion and action. Here are practical ways to cultivate this discipline. 1. Delay your response deliberately. When pressure mounts, your first goal is not to respond, it's to regain control. Step back from the situation. Take a short walk. Pause before you act, the power of reflection. Breathe deeply or say, "Let me think about that and get back to you." This buys you clarity. Time doesn't just heal wounds, it sharpens decisions. In business, Warren Buffett often says, "You don't have to swing at every pitch." His greatest investments were made by waiting for the right opportunity, not the fast one. Patience is not passivity, it's precision. 2. Name your emotions. Psychologists call this affect labeling. When you name what you feel, anger, fear, frustration, you reduce its power over you. Writing it down or saying it aloud to yourself helps you see emotion as information, not instruction. Emotion tells you something important is happening. It doesn't tell you what to do about it. 3. Ask clarifying questions. The pause is most powerful when filled with the right questions. Try asking, what exactly am I reacting to? What am I trying to protect or achieve? How will this decision look tomorrow or 10 years from now? What does wisdom require here? These questions separate urgency from importance, emotion from logic. 4. Practice micro-pauses daily. You don't need a crisis to practice stillness. Build it into your routine. Before replying to a difficult email, before saying yes to a new project, before making a purchase, pause. Even 10 seconds of reflection can prevent hours of regret. Over time, this becomes a reflex of composure. 5. Develop a pause ritual. For some, it's deep breathing. For others, prayer, journaling, or short solitude. Create your own ritual that signals your mind to slow down and center itself. Nehemiah's was fasting and prayer. Yours might be meditation, silence, or a simple question. Is this the wisest next step? When you control the pause, you control the out. One of the clearest examples of this principle is found in aviation. In moments of mechanical failure, pilots are trained not to react instantly. The first rule is, sit on your hands. Why? Because premature action can worsen the problem. The correct move requires composure, not panic. The same principle applies to leadership, relationships, and everyday life. Every time you resist the urge to react, you strengthen your strategic muscle. The pause is a form of mastery over yourself, over your impulses, over chaos. It gives you what reactive people never have: leverage. When Nehemiah finally acted, his response carried power because pause before you act, the power of reflection. It was preceded by thought. He didn't just feel the problem, he understood it. He wasn't moved by pressure, he was guided by purpose. That is the essence of strategic leadership. The wisdom to wait until your emotions settle and your insight rises. The strength of stillness. Every great work begins in silence. Before the first stone of Jerusalem was lifted, before the first command was given, there was a pause, a deliberate moment of stillness where Nehemiah chose to think, to pray, and to feel. That moment became the seed of strategy. His success didn't start with movement, it started with reflection. Whether in life, leadership, or business, the pause remains one of the most underrated forms of power. We live in a world that celebrates speed, yet it is reflection that sustains success. Those who learn to wait, observe, and understand before acting often accomplish more with less effort. The pause is not an absence of progress. It is the preparation for precise progress. When you master the pause, you begin to see patterns others miss. You make fewer mistakes, communicate with clarity, and act with purpose. Whether you are leading a team, rebuilding a dream, or navigating personal loss, reflection transforms reaction into strategy. It's in stillness that the mind regains its balance and the heart regains its strength. Nehemiah's story teaches us that wisdom is not in how quickly you move, but in how deeply you understand. His tears became vision, his waiting became strategy, and his silence became strength. The same can be true for you. So before you send that message, make that decision, or take that next big step, pause. Sit with what you've heard, feel it, think it through, pray if you must, reflect if you will. The goal is not to do nothing, but to do the right thing at the right time, for the right reason. Because true strategy is not born in haste, it is born in stillness. And in that stillness, you discover not just what to do, but who you are becoming as you do it.